Over the course of the last couple of weeks, I've told you about the FBI's ongoing investigation into Jane Sanders and how basically it's a political witch hunt that was initiated by the Republican equivalent of David Brock. Now, when you read most of the articles about it, most outlets have been surprisingly objective and they state all the facts about the case, and ultimately they conclude that nothing will likely come of this. However, there's the Washington Post, which is an outlet that is notorious for trying to smear Bernie Sanders, and they decided to opportunistically publish a story surrounding the investigation, and shortly after it was published, the main premise of the article was disproven. So they published an article talking about how prosecutors in this case wanted to subpoena Jane before a grand jury and potentially even Bernie, but the prosecutor only decided to request documents instead. The problem with that is it's completely false. The grand jury never made a decision between documents and Jane. They only had asked for the documents to begin with. So in their editor's note, they state an earlier version of this story quoted James C. Foley Jr., an attorney for an official with the Vermont Bonding Agency, as saying that his client was initially called to appear before a grand jury, but that prosecutors later agreed that documents alone would be sufficient. Foley clarified late Monday, however, that the grand jury subpoena required only that documents be turned over. The story has been updated. So if Jane Sanders isn't actually being called to appear before a grand jury, or if they hadn't even considered that they wanted to call her to have her appear before the grand jury, then they really have no story here. So after they had to issue that retraction, this is the new news that they were left with. They report a federal investigation of a land deal led by Jane Sanders, the wife and political advisor of Senator Bernie Sanders, has accelerated in recent months, with prosecutors hauling off more than a dozen boxes of records from the Vermont college she once ran and calling a state official to provide evidence for a grand jury, according to interviews and documents. Half a dozen people said in interviews in recent days that they had been contacted by the FBI or federal prosecutors, and former college trustees told the Washington Post that attorneys for Jane Sanders had interviewed them to learn what potential witnesses might tell the government. So the big news is that the grand jury is requesting documents. That's not news. That's not a story. In any probe, of course it's the case that they're going to need documents. But nonetheless, the title of the article is Federal Prosecutors Step Up the Probe, because they want you to think that this is getting more serious. And while the case is actually serious, nobody is surprised that the grand jury is requesting documents. Are you kidding me? So they use this case as an opportunity to bash Bernie Sanders, but they couldn't even bother to verify the facts. And the most important detail, which is crucial, that they were basing their article on. So that's just one of the many embarrassments that the Washington Post has had to suffer through lately. And it's not just that, the retraction itself is a problem, but there's more to this article that I take issue with. So they don't talk about the entirety of the issue. So they conveniently leave out really important aspects of the story. So they mention Brady Townsend twice, who is the individual who initiated this lawsuit. He petitioned the Justice Department to investigate Jane Sanders, but they made zero mentions about the role of Brady Townsend in the Vermont Republican Party and how he's accused countless public officials of corruption under frivolous and false pretenses. That's a huge component of the story because it sheds light on the motivations of the individual who initiated this investigation in the first place. How could you leave out that component of the story? It's huge. It's everything. But it's the Washington Post. So we really shouldn't be surprised because they're not necessarily motivated by the facts as much as they're motivated in their agenda, and currently their agenda is bashing Bernie Sanders at every chance they get. And, if they see something like this FBI investigation, of course they're going to be opportunistic and jump on any new detail that seems to incriminate Bernie Sanders, but they're willing to do so to the detriment of themselves because they can't even get their facts straight. And again, they've done this with Russia stories. They've done this multiple times. They repeatedly mess up, but yet they claim, and they're touted as one of the best journalistic outlets in the country when the Washington Post has gone to shit. And ironically, at the top of their page, they state, "Democracy dies in darkness." Well, you're not helping with that effort by spreading propaganda at the behest of the political establishment. This isn't about Jane Sanders committing bank fraud or being corrupt. This is about a political smear merchant for the Republican Party who, while claiming to care about ethics, was the campaign chair of the most unethical candidate in American history, Donald Trump, who said that we should kill the families of ISIS in Middle Eastern countries. So he doesn't care about ethics. He cares about smearing Bernie Sanders because he doesn't like the fact that Bernie Sanders doesn't receive as much scrutiny as other politicians. Well, it's because Bernie Sanders isn't corrupt, unlike the vast majority of politicians in Washington, D.C. So they would also not receive scrutiny if they were not corrupt themselves. So look, this whole thing with the Washington Post is just one of the many reasons why they should be embarrassed, but they're not, because the Washington Post is shameless. Again, it's not about the news, it's about their agenda, which is the case with most corporate-controlled news organizations.
Support this podcast by joining the independent progressive media revolution today at humanistreport.com.